The co-op stank of feathers, rot, and the slow decay of forgotten things. Abigail sat curled in the farthest corner, knees pressed into the dirty straw, her dress torn at the hem where the deacon's wife had ripped it and declared her cursed. Useless, a barren woman, fit for no man's legacy, fit for nothing at all. Those words echoed through her like the slow toll of a funeral bell. Louder than the clucking around her, louder than her own heartbeat. Barren, that's all it had taken. One letter from a doctor after 10 years of trying. And suddenly she was no longer a wife, no longer a woman, just a burden no one wanted to claim. Amos, her husband, had walked her to the church gates with silence so thick it scraped against her skin. He handed the letter to the Reverend without a glance back, then turned and left her standing there with the wind tugging at her sleeves like even the air was trying to get away from her. The Reverend's wife had said it was God's will. The townsfolk called it charity, letting her stay in the chicken coop out back rather than casting her into the wilderness. But Abigail knew what it truly was. Punishment, disguised as mercy, wrapped in pity and offered like moldy bread. At night, she huddled beneath feed sacks to keep warm, the wind slicing through the wooden slats like knives. Her body shook, not just from the cold but from shame that clung to her bones heavier than any frost. She hadn't cried in weeks. Not properly. What good would it do? There was no one to listen, no one to care. In Millstone Creek, a woman without a child might as well be invisible. And Abigail had become exactly that. The children called her Chicken Lady. They tossed pebbles at the walls of her co-op like they were testing a cage, daring each other to speak to her, to poke the ghost that no longer answered. She hadn't spoken in days. Words had withered in her throat like the rest of her. There was a time, not so long ago, when Abigail had dreams, silly, tender dreams of cradles and lullabies, of shared breakfasts and garden rows. She had tried. Oh, how she had tried. Month after month, she counted days and whispered prayers. Watched the eyes of her husband grow duller with each passing disappointment. Each silence stretched longer. Each smile took more effort. Until there were no smiles left at all. She hadn't known it would end like this. Not in anger, not in betrayal, just abandonment, quiet and final. No parting words, no questions, just that letter, that verdict. Infertile. And in Millstone, infertility was a death sentence, not of body, but of worth. She became a ghost long before she was sent to the co-op. People stopped addressing her directly, stopped meeting her eyes. In church, pews shifted away from hers. Whispers floated behind her back like spider silk, light and cutting. Even the women who once laughed with her over jars of jam now spoke in hushes, as if her condition were contagious. She couldn't remember the last time someone said her name without scorn. The co-op creaked around her as chickens scratched at the floor. Indifferent to her presence, they were warm, at least, alive. She envied their simplicity, their usefulness. At least they gave eggs. What did she give? She tried, once, to explain to the Reverend's wife that she had done everything she could. Herbs, doctors, months of rest, prayers whispered into linens and buried in the garden. But the woman didn't want reasons. She wanted results. And when Abigail had none, she became nothing more than a mouth to feed. A reminder of failure. A blot on her husband's name. The co-op wasn't meant to be a home. It was meant to make her disappear. And it had worked. She no longer dreamed, no longer sang, no longer moved except to eat or breathe. The straw clung to her dress, to her hair, like the last remnants of a world that had spit her out. She would sit there until her body gave up, she thought, and even then, they might not notice, or worse, they might simply replace her with another lost woman, another body without a future. She wondered, sometimes, what people thought when they looked at her, if they even looked at all. Did they see her as a warning? A shame? Or had she faded so far from their minds that she was just another part of the co-op? Another fixture in the background of their neatly ordered lives? No one called her Abigail anymore. Just her, or that one, or the barren woman. Even her own voice had turned strange in her mind, like something borrowed from another time. She mouthed words sometimes, silently, in the dark, just to remember what they felt like. But sound no longer came. There was no point, and so she sat, day after day, among feathers and shit and straw, In silence. In shadow. Not alive. Not dead. Just left behind. Until something changed. But she didn't know that yet. All she knew was the ache in her spine. The sting in her eyes. And the quiet hope that maybe one day, someone, anyone, might look through the cracks in the wood and see not a ghost, but a woman who used to be named Abigail. The morning was quiet, as always, the same kind of quiet that had nothing to do with peace. It was the silence of being unseen, forgotten. Abigail sat in the co-op, her arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the chickens scratch the straw. Dust hung in golden shafts between the warped wooden slats. The church bell had rung an hour ago, but she no longer counted time by its chimes. Time meant nothing when you were no one. And then, hooves. She heard them before she saw him. A horse, steady and slow, approaching the chapel gates. Visitors were rare in Millstone Creek. Those who passed through didn't stop. Not unless they had business. Or grief. She leaned toward the narrow cracks in the wall, her breath catching as a tall man dismounted. He moved like someone who carried weight, not just on his shoulders, but in his soul. A long duster clung to his frame, coated in dust from the prairie. He didn't look like a preacher, or a trader, or anyone the church would welcome. But it wasn't his clothes that made Abigail's heart stutter. It was the fact that he looked at her. Right through the slats, right through the filth and shadow and shame. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. His eyes met hers and held, steady and unreadable. Her first instinct was to turn her face, to lower her gaze like she'd been taught. Shame was a habit by now. She wasn't supposed to meet eyes, especially not with men. Especially not as what she was. And yet, he didn't look at her the way the others did. There was no judgment in him. No pity. No revulsion. Just attention. Quiet, whole attention, like she was a person. Moments later, through the open air, she heard the voice of the Reverend's wife. "She's barren," the woman said, cold, factual. "We did all we could. The co-op keeps her safe. You know how men talk." "I know," came the reply. The stranger's voice was low, like distant thunder. "I'm not like other men." She was married, the Reverend's wife added, almost in defense. She failed him. There was a pause, a long, weighty pause. "Maybe," the man said, "he failed her." Abigail felt the words land inside her like something breaking open. No one had ever said that. Not once. Not even in whispers. She dared another glance through the wall. The man was walking toward her now, boots crunching over dry gravel. He stopped at the door of the co-op. "What's your name?" he asked. Her throat felt like sand. It took effort to answer. "Abigail." He nodded. "I'm Samuel Wren. I'm a widower. My ranch needs a cook. Not a womb." He paused. "If you'd like to stand up and leave with me, I won't stop you." The silence that followed felt deafening. Abigail didn't move, couldn't. Her mind swirled with questions. Was this a trick? A test? Another form of cruelty wrapped in kindness? She searched his face, not for lies, for truth, and what she saw there made her tremble. Not hunger, not possession, just space, a space he was willing to share. Her hand reached for the latch before her mind had even caught up. And when she stepped out into the light, blinking, half expecting the sky to fall or someone to shout or drag her back, no one did. No one said a word. No one stopped them. Samuel helped her onto his horse without comment. His hand was firm but not rough. His eyes didn't wander. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Abigail felt the weight of a touch that didn't carry expectation. Just support. They rode through the middle of town. The children who once giggled and threw husks at the co-op now stood silent, watching like they were seeing a ghost rise from the dead. Maybe they were. Abigail held onto the saddle, her fingers trembling, but she wasn't afraid of Samuel. She was afraid of how safe she felt. Afraid of how easily the world shifted the moment someone saw her as more than a label or a burden. Not once did he ask what she could give him. Not once did he ask why she had been cast aside. He just offered space beside him. Offered her a place. Not because she could bear children. Not because she owed him anything. But because she was. And somewhere between the coop and the open prairie, Abigail felt something stir in her chest that she thought had long since withered and died. Hope. Not the wild, desperate kind she once clung to in prayer. But something quieter, more steady, The kind of hope that came not from being saved, but from being offered a choice. And that, more than anything, was what undid her. She was not a stray he'd picked up out of pity. Not a project. Not a debt to be repaid. She was Abigail. And Samuel Wren had spoken to her like she mattered. Like she had worth. Not because of what she could produce, but because she still breathed. As the ranch came into view in the distance, simple and square against the horizon, Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she might finally begin. The ranch was not grand. The barn roof sagged. The fences leaned like tired men. The porch creaked with every gust of wind. But to Abigail, it felt like something she hadn't known in years. Space. Space that didn't judge her. Space that didn't whisper behind her back. A place where she could breathe. The first night in the loft, she couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. Too clean. Her body missed the hardness of the co-op floor. The scratch of straw. The cold that reminded her she was still alive. Safety felt foreign. Suspicious. Even. But the fire downstairs crackled gently. And Samuel didn't lock the door. Didn't demand anything. He simply offered her warmth. A clean bed. And silence, not the cruel kind, but the comforting kind that came with peace. In the morning, she heard him moving about the kitchen. Tools clinking. The smell of coffee thick in the air. For a moment, she stayed still, unsure of her place. Then she remembered, this was her place now. Too, if she chose it. She stepped down the narrow loft stairs and he glanced up, offering a quiet nod. No surprise, no inspection, just a tin mug and a seat at the table. "You'll sleep better in a few days," he said simply. She nodded, wrapping her hands around the mug. The heat seeped into her palms like courage. She hadn't realized how long it had been since someone let her move at her own pace. That day, she offered to help. Her hands were soft from disuse. From too many months of hiding, sweeping, and surviving. When she tried hauling rope and clearing branches, her palms blistered quickly. She winced but didn't complain. Samuel noticed, of course. He always did. "I've got salve for that," he said, not unkindly. She hesitated. "I want to earn this," she whispered. "You already are," he replied, then returned to his task, leaving her dignity intact. Each day brought something new. She learned to mend fences, how to keep a fire going even in wind, how to boil coffee the way he liked it. She swept out the barn, not because it was expected of her, but because it felt good to do something that had results. Clear floors, clean corners. No one criticized. No one called it wasted effort. And in the kitchen, she began to rediscover herself. She hadn't baked in years. Amos had once told her it was pointless. "What's the use of baking if there's no one to eat it but us?" he'd said, looking at her flat belly like it was a broken promise. But here, in the small wooden cabin with the breeze rustling the curtains and sunlight dancing on the counter, she felt the pull again. She kneaded dough one morning, unsure if it would rise. Her arms ached, her motions clumsy. Samuel walked in, saw the flour on her sleeves, and said with a faint smile, "I heard your hands before I saw you. I needed to do something that didn't feel like hiding," she said quietly. He nodded. "Bread is honest. If it rises, it rises." And when it did, golden, crusty, steaming from the oven, she felt a rush of pride she hadn't known in years. Not the pride of being perfect. The pride of being capable. They ate in silence, but it wasn't hollow. He chewed slowly, then made a low, appreciative sound. "It's been a long time since I tasted bread that didn't come from a trade post." She smiled, not because she sought praise, but because she felt seen. Her effort mattered. Later, she sat on the porch beside him, watching the stars blink into life. The sky was wide here, wider than she remembered. It didn't press in like the ceiling of the co-op had. It opened. "I didn't know how much I needed to be seen," she said at last. "Then stay seen," he said simply, "as long as you want." She looked at her hands. Calloused now, a bit rough, and stronger. These were not the hands of a ghost woman anymore. These were working hands, living hands. In the weeks that followed, she took on more. She patched clothes, sorted seeds, even sat at the old upright piano in the corner of the cabin, brushing the dust off keys. Her fingers stumbled at first, but muscle memory whispered notes she thought she'd forgotten. She didn't play for anyone. She played for herself. One evening, as she hung laundry beneath the setting sun, she caught her reflection in the window glass, face smudged with dirt. Sleeves rolled, hair pulled back with a scrap of cloth. She didn't look delicate or forgotten anymore. She looked real. Not the woman she used to be. Not the woman Amos had discarded. Someone new. Someone becoming. Samuel never asked for anything. But he always made space. Whether she was quiet or talkative, confident or unsure, he adjusted. He didn't fill silences with assumptions or try to fix the things she hadn't spoken aloud. He just stood nearby, hammering a post or boiling stew, solid as the earth beneath her feet. And in that steadiness, she began to rise. Not like bread, like herself. She sewed again, not baby clothes, not table runners for some future dinner party. Just a quilt, square by square, with scraps she found tucked in old boxes. Each piece had a story. Some she remembered, some she gave new meaning. When Samuel asked what the quilt was for, she smiled. For what survived, she said, not what was lost. And as she stitched beneath the flicker of firelight, she didn't tremble anymore. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had stopped defining her. Here, with dirt under her nails and fire in her chest, Abigail was not rebuilding the woman she once was, she was building someone new. The first sign came not in the form of a man, but a message. Smoke curled over the ridge, dark and bitter. By the time Abigail and Samuel reached the side barn, it was already half engulfed in flame. Samuel threw water with practiced urgency. Abigail didn't wait for permission, she grabbed a bucket and joined him. Her sleeves wet, her hair clinging to her face, lungs burning with every breath. They fought until the barn collapsed inward in a hiss of steam and ash. Nailed to the fence beside the ruin was a plank, scorched at the edges. She was never yours to keep. Abigail read it once, then again. Her hands shook, but she tore it down, splinters cutting her palms. It's him, she said, Amos. Samuel didn't curse. He didn't rage. He simply stood beside her as she caught her breath. Ash falling like snow around them. He wants control back, Samuel said, but he won't get it. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't hide. She stood on the porch beneath the stars, soot still under her nails, and whispered the name she once bore like it was a question, Abigail Carter. Then, louder, Abigail Ruth Wren. The wind carried it off like a vow. He came 3 days later, riding slow, as if every hoofbeat was rehearsed. His coat was pressed, black and too tight across the shoulders. He wore the same boots he'd worn to their wedding, but his hair had thinned, and his eyes no longer held the sharpness of control. Abigail stood on the porch when he arrived. She didn't move, didn't shift behind Samuel. She folded her hands in front of her and met Amos Carter's gaze with a steadiness he'd never seen in her before. He flinched, slightly. Abigail, he said, forcing a half smile. You look well. I am, she replied, despite you. His eyes darted to Samuel, who stood beside her like stone. Amos's smile tightened. Came to take you home. Thought maybe you'd had your say. Samuel stepped forward. She is home. Amos snorted. You a preacher now? No, Samuel said calmly. Just a man who doesn't put women in cages. The insult didn't land like a slap. It landed like a verdict. Amos's tone hardened. She was sick, the doctor said. The doctor said we couldn't have children. Abigail interrupted. He didn't tell you to lock me in a chicken coop. That was your sentence, not his. Amos looked around, as if expecting backup from the shadows of memory. You're my wife. You gave that up, she said, the day you walked away and handed my name to a reverend like I was trash on his doorstep. He looked to Samuel again, trying for masculine camaraderie, but Samuel's gaze was steel. You burned a barn, he said. You sent boys with threats. You want to pretend this is about love? Abigail stepped forward then, just past Samuel, just enough to show Amos she needed no one to shield her. I don't belong to anyone, she said, but I choose to stay here. Because I was asked, not commanded. Amos opened his mouth, then closed it. She continued, you won't find what you're looking for here. And you won't find the woman you once controlled either. She's gone. He turned, stiff with pride, mounted his horse, and rode off without a word. And this time, Abigail didn't watch him go in silence. She exhaled with something deeper than relief. Something heavier than rage. Freedom. A week later, a clerk from Millstone arrived on horseback. His coat dusted with miles. His hands trembling as he handed over a document. Your husband, he began, filed a claim that you abandoned your legal residence. He's attempting to regain your name. Or compensation for it. Abigail read the document. The ink seemed to crawl across the page like old venom. So he means to sell me, she said flatly. I don't agree with it. The clerk said, and there's a way out. There's a judge coming through Fort Wren in 3 days. If you speak your declaration there, this ends, permanently. She didn't need time to think. We ride at dawn. The courthouse in Fort Wren was nothing but timber and nails. A bell hung crooked above the door. But inside, it felt like a cathedral. Abigail stepped forward before the judge with her shoulders square and voice clear. I'm here to sever all legal ties to Amos Carter, she said. He offered me no protections. No land, no home, only shame. The judge raised a brow. Do you wish to submit a new surname? Abigail glanced once toward Samuel. Then forward again. Abigail Ruth Wren, she said. A beat passed. Not because he gave it to me, she added, because I chose it. The judge stamped the page. So noted. Outside the courthouse, she stood in sunlight. It was the first time in years that her breath felt like it belonged to her alone. You didn't have to take my name, Samuel said gently. I know, she replied, but I earned it. When they returned home, Samuel carved her name, A. Wren, into the porch beam with his own hand. You sure? He asked. So am I, she replied. And as the wind rustled the fields and the birds called overhead, Abigail knew she hadn't just faced her past. She had rewritten it. With fire, with voice, with her name. And she would never again be silent. The first time Abigail saw her full name etched into wood, Abigail Ruth Wren, she didn't cry. She stood on the porch as Samuel stepped back, wiping sawdust from his hands. The sun filtered through the bare-limbed trees, lighting the carved letters where they shimmered just above the doorframe. A. Wren, permanent, sturdy, chosen. You sure? Samuel had asked, one brow raised, his chisel still in hand. She touched the letters with the tips of her fingers. The wood was fresh, still warm from the blade. Her voice didn't shake. So am I. It was her name now. Not inherited, not given, not assigned at marriage or whispered behind her back in disgrace. She had stood in a courthouse, raised her chin, and declared it aloud in front of men who once might have called her property. Not anymore. She wasn't someone's shame. She wasn't someone's empty cradle. She was Abigail Ruth Wren. That winter, they rebuilt the barn together. Samuel cut new planks. Abigail stacked the lumber. Her arms ached with every haul. Her hands cracked in the cold. But she welcomed the pain. It was a clean kind of ache, the kind that came from building something. Not being broken down. At night, they sat by the fire in silence. But it wasn't the silence of fear. It wasn't the silence she'd lived in back in Millstone Creek. The silence of a co-op where her voice had turned to dust. This was a silence of peace. Of mutual presence. She didn't need to fill it to prove her worth. Samuel didn't need her to perform. Or reassure him. Or explain herself. They just existed, side by side. And that was enough. Some evenings, she worked on the quilt she'd started all those years ago. A piece of faded muslin. Each square once sewn with dreams she was too afraid to finish. For years it had lived in the bottom of a drawer. Folded like regret. Now it lived on her lap. Slowly becoming whole. Samuel asked once, "You remember what each square was meant to mean?" She shook her head. Not really. Then sew new meaning into them. He said simply, "You don't need to remember what they were. Just decide what they are now." So she did. Strength. Grace. Survival. Not for the life she lost, but for the one she was building with her own 2 hands. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in the hollows first, leaving behind patches of wet earth and the scent of growing things. Abigail planted for the first time in years. Not because she expected a child. Not because she was trying to fill some role. But because she wanted to watch something grow that she chose to tend. She learned the land, the places that held water longest, the fence posts that needed mending, the way Samuel brewed coffee and left it simmering all morning because he didn't like to rush. One afternoon, while mending a sagging corner of the porch, She caught her reflection in a bucket of water, hair tied back. Arms strong, face smudged with dirt and sun. She almost didn't recognize herself. Not because she looked different. Because she looked real. Not the ghost of a wife. Not the chicken lady. Not the quiet failure everyone pitied or ignored. But a woman who had walked out of her past and into something she had no name for at the time, but now did. Home. Letters came once, maybe twice, from the county, unsigned but bitter in tone. Amos had left Millstone. There was no forwarding trail. No threats. Just legal dust kicked up by someone still trying to own what had already slipped from his hands. Abigail didn't even read the second one. She threw it into the stove and watched it curl into flame. When Samuel asked if she wanted to respond, she said only, "He was never the end of me. Just the middle." By summer, the quilt was finished. She laid it across the bed one morning as the window filled with light. It wasn't perfect. The stitching was uneven in places. A corner drooped slightly where she'd misjudged the backing. But it was hers. Her life. Sewn into fabric. Not for children that never came. Not for a family that abandoned her. But for the woman who had been locked away, and had the courage to walk out when someone offered her a door. Not a cage. Later that day, as she sat on the porch brushing crumbs from her apron, a rider passed on the far trail. Just a traveler, maybe a merchant. He raised a hand in greeting. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wren," he called. Abigail blinked. Not because he recognized her, but because the name landed softly in the air like it belonged there. Mrs. Wren. Not a title forced on her. Not an identity thrust onto her shoulders. But a name she had chosen. In a place where her voice mattered. And for the first time in her life, being called by someone else's surname didn't feel like erasure. It felt like honor. Because this one hadn't been taken. It had been earned. That night, she sat beside Samuel on the porch. Their hands resting near one another but not entwined, close. But not claimed. "I thought I'd feel smaller when I let go of the past," she said, looking toward the edge of the fields. "But I feel taller. Not because of pride, because I can stand without shaking." Samuel glanced sideways. "You don't need anyone to recognize that, Abigail." She turned to him, her voice steady. "I do. I need me to recognize it." He smiled, quiet and proud. And together, as the sun dipped low and the stars began to sing their nightly chorus, they sat in the doorway of a home they had both built, one nail. One name, one choice at a time. No cages, no locked doors, just warmth. And a name that carried meaning because she had given it meaning.